Here's a few thoughts on getting your essay prepared for the question, what are the causes of rising obesity and diabetes in the world? I had slightly different phrasing than what you have in your assignment, but pretty close. And I'm going to focus maybe a little more on the case of the United States here, but it will be broadly applicable to the whole world for reasons that you might already understand, and also some reasons that I'm going to at least suggest here in what we do. Okay, so in thinking about this, let's go back to a diagram that we all looked at, hopefully, and that's our guns, germs, and steel one, just to get the proximate and ultimate factors figured out, what all that means, right? So this isn't quite the diagram for the first essay you did, because it lacks the early start on settlement. But it's pretty close, and so it's useful to think about. A causal mechanism is something that describes why something happens, and a diagram like this is a really great way to understand what a causal mechanism is. So the causal mechanisms of why the Europeans were able to come over and decimate other societies in the Americas and elsewhere in the world, rather than those other societies doing that to the Europeans. We're talking particularly in the Americas now as a comparison. The proximate factors, the ones that everybody's had in history courses for a long, long time, are nothing new and not really very mysterious either, are all these down the bottom. These are things that you probably had a pretty good idea of before you took the class, right? So when we say those kinds of things, very often that's kind of where it ends. And that's the problem, because what caused all of these advantages to accrue to the Eurasians in the form of the Europeans, in this case, as they did what they did in late 1400s and in the 1500s, 1600s. So that's where we need a causal mechanism. So when we go back, and just to take one little branch of this quickly, one of the causal mechanisms is that the Eurasians had food surpluses and food storage, which allowed them to have large, dense, sedentary, stratified societies, and from that led a beneficial loop of technological development that gave them the gun, steel, storage, ocean-going ships, and also those large, dense, sedentary, stratified societies had a more sophisticated political organization and writing, which enabled them to remember and build upon what had already been learned. And of course, there's the age-old epidemic diseases. You guys are now know a lot more about that than you used to, probably too. Not because of this class, though, necessarily. But getting, to many suitable wild species and many domesticated plant and animal species is something that most people hadn't really thought of when Jared Diamond wrote his book. And so he brings in that ultimate factor. He also talks about, hey, there were some places that had those suitable wild species and some that didn't. And if they had a nice, easy east-west axis to spread across these suitable wild and domestic species as they were domesticated, east and west across that axis, those places, i.e. Eurasians, had great advantages, because even if they didn't have them in their local area, they could get them from somewhere else. That's the basic idea, right? So that is a causal mechanism then flowing through here down to the proximate factors. Okay, now if we go then into our own kind of problematic of how do we use or create such a diagram and a description of causal mechanisms for this question, okay? And so to do that, it probably is easiest just to start with the proximate factors. So almost anybody you ask, why is it that over the last, half a century, especially the last 30 years or so, Americans, meaning in the United States in this case, have gotten fatter? What's going on? Our genetics didn't change, right? And it didn't just happen out of thin air. There was a reason. So people say, well, they're eating too much. That would be one explanation. Or not only are they eating too much, but they're eating processed food products instead of whole foods or just foods, as Michael Pollan would say. Okay, and so that's a very real, correct, yet superficial explanation. Those are the proximate factors. That's like saying, oh, the Europeans had guns and germs and therefore they conquered the Americas. But gee, why didn't the Native Americans have guns and germs in the same way that the Europeans had, right? So we need to get into the ultimate factors. Um, I already gave you a couple of the obvious proximate factors, and you know those, probably knew those before you took this class, so that's not mysterious. But we have to work our way back a little bit then, and so one way to do that is just to kind of figure out, well, just in a very superficial way, why is it that we're eating more foods like that? And this is where you want to jot this down. Marion Nestle and also the scientist from Brazil, Carlos, and I'm trying to remember his last name right offhand, but in Globesity, and us actually even the other scientists there as well. All three of them talk about kind of moving back one step from this. Why are we making these bad food choices? And Nestle especially is really good at describing that. And so there's a whole bunch of things that have happened. And those are largely the food industry that is in operation there. So kind of an intermediate between proximate and ultimate has to be the processed food industry, the marketing arm of it, the fast food industry, the retailing food industry. All of those are doing a lot of things to get us to eat more foods and more low quality foods. But that still begs the question, how does that come to be? That does get us partway there, though. So that's a good start. Working back, then we need to think about a little bit why the industry would behave that way when they knew long ago that these things are dangerous. And so they are driven by the profit incentive in global capitalism. And it's not just national, as you saw in the case of Brazil and China and India, some of the poorer parts of Mexico and so on. This is a global problem, and it is a global capitalist system. And the profit motive means sell more and make more profit. Now, one way that you do that is if you've been reading or looking rather at the documentary Food Inc., and you've been reading some of Michael Pollan's work in Omnivore's Dilemma, you're getting some sense of that. So if you kind of scan through all of those questions in there, that helps us understand a little more about how that end of the industry works. But it also goes back further. It isn't just the food industry that makes products for us to eat, but there are a lot of other things that happen as well. So working our way farther backwards, there's a kind of industry that buys up the raw agricultural products. And it's in their interest as well to have large sales. There's only a few firms in the entire industry, and so they have a lot of control over that. And it's in their interest policy-wise. Think about this. They want cheap grains, okay? That way they can sell cheap and have bigger markets and have big volume, and that's where they make their money. So the Cargills of the world, the ADMs of the world, and so on. And some of that you see a little bit in the Food Inc. and some of Michael Pollan's work as well. And so they have huge influence. They're hugely profitable. And so that's part of the whole story. So they have lobbied. So there's a whole government policy piece working further back, getting closer to really, I mean, largely, we're pretty almost there at least, ultimate causes. But in the end, there's a lot of this. It isn't just about the food industry, but it goes back to the agro industry. So remember, food industry, and then they're supplied by the agro distribution and processing industries. That's part of the Michael Pollan Omnivore's Dilemma story. But going farther back, there's also there's the agricultural industry itself, the farmers, okay? But they're kind of really squeezed as pawns in between the powerful forces that supply them and that they supply to. They have no pricing power with their buyers. The buyers have the pricing power. Fortunately, there are some markets in place, so there is some competition there. So the big grain buyers, the buyers with soybeans and so on, wheat, they have some competition, but there's only a few firms there, so it's a highly profitable, very closed, mostly not publicly traded companies kind of industry. All right. So, but going back, so you have the farmers there. Now, they have some political influence in that there are a lot of them in farm states, and every farm state, whether they have 400,000 people or several million, have two senators, just like California with, what is it, something like 38 million. So they have a disproportionate political influence, and that has to be part of our story. But the bigger part, most people I think that study this carefully would argue, is that there is also a very powerful group of agro production and chemical input suppliers. And you saw some of those in Food Inc. And in fact, you saw that Republican and Democrat politicians at the national level alike, both parties are involved in this problem. They happen to sit on boards of some of these big companies. Okay. Why would prominent politicians before and after their campaigns be sitting on these boards? Think about that a little bit. So if you sit on a board and then you end up in the office, that gives these companies influence. Or if you've been in office already, one of your rewards is to sit on these boards and collect large paychecks for having a few meetings a year and making the right choices, right? So you have the story of the kind of monopolization of the supply system and the complete control, really, of the growing of chickens and the slaughtering of chickens systems that you saw in Food Inc. This gives for very low cost, highly mechanized kinds of production. The farmer makes very, very little money in these systems, is squeezed on both ends. He's got these input supplies, and the farmer, he or she, also is selling to a very small number of buyers. Okay, and so that production inputs, chemical inputs industry then is extremely powerful, and they have shaped policy going back till. And if you read Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, you'll see when that was. I'm not going to give you the answer to that or any more details, but it's all in those questions and in those readings. So what you have working backwards then gets way back to U.S. farm policy, the influence of the major agro food input companies, chemicals, seed packages, even mechanization, the whole nine yards. But also farm policy is influenced by those distribution companies that buy the grains and then sell them to the food processing industry. Of course, the food processing industry has political influence as well. They don't want to be regulated. And even the products that they produce or that they sell to producers, they've pushed really hard for not being regulated either in terms of even putting what's on there inside those products. So you have a very big system here, and we've identified most of the components, and it's up to you. If you want an A, though, you got to do a little better than what I did. You got to look a little deeper, but that gives you a pretty good start, I think, on that. And so if you just go back and maybe you want to listen to what I did again, it's about 13 minutes worth there. You can draw out some circles and make a diagram kind of like the one in Guns, Germs, and Steel. And then when you just describe how all of that lays out, you have a causal mechanism. I described it working backwards, but maybe the best way you can write that way, or maybe an even better, elegant way is to sort of write it where you start with the ultimate causes and identifying those, and then how they drove a system of very, very cheap food, made it possible to have highly processed inputs, such as, well, the most famous being the corn syrup, of course, high fructose corn syrup. And you've seen quite a bit about that in some of the documentaries, including Secrets of Sugar. And that gets you well on your way. So draw out the whole thing if you can, or if you don't want to draw, you're not very good at that, that's fine. But describe it in a nice, organized way, and you should do just fine on that essay. What I don't want you to do is just say, oh, we're all eating too much, or we're all eating low-quality foods. That's a great set of proximate factors, but it doesn't tell us why. And the forces in play now are much larger than they used to be, and that's why the problem has gotten worse. Okay, so it's not really mysterious, but it does take a little education, a little thinking through to get beyond the superficial. Well, you just need to eat less. Sounds nice, not so simple. Okay, hope this helps.